You've entered another mysterious chapter with Mr. Geronimo. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment your country below. The boots were what I found first. A pair of Danner hiking boots, size 11, sitting upright on the trail as if someone had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the timber. The laces were still tied. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just two boots on packed earth and the forest holding its breath around them. I had been working the ridgeline section of the Monongahela corridor that July, the summer of 2019, covering a stretch of Appalachian backcountry that most seasonal visitors never reach. Hollows so deep the sun only touched the creek beds for an hour each afternoon. Ridges choked with rhododendron so thick, a person could walk 10 feet off trail and vanish completely. I had spent 11 years carrying a badge through those woods, and the mountains had taught me to read every broken branch, every displaced stone, every silence where bird song should have been. What the mountains taught me that summer is something I have never been able to forget. It started on the 4th of July. I was stationed at the Cranberry Wilderness Outpost, a single-room structure with a radio, a cot, and a window that looked out over a valley so vast it could swallow weather systems whole. My assignment was standard: monitor trail conditions, log wildlife activity, assist hikers who wandered beyond their skill level. The group that registered at the trailhead that morning seemed competent enough, and that false sense of adequacy is where things tend to go wrong. There were 6 of them. Ronald Simmons was the one who signed the permit. 43 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who shook your hand like he was trying to prove something. He told me they were a mixed group, some family, some friends, all planning to spend a week hiking, fishing, maybe a little hunting. I explained the regulations. I marked their intended campsite on the topographic map. He answered my standard questions with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before. Behind him, the others were unloading gear from 2 SUVs. Brenda Russell, 57, was organizing packs with quiet efficiency. She was Ronald's aunt, and she wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a walking stick carved from dogwood that had seen more miles than most vehicles. Jeffrey Griffin, 66, stood apart, studying the tree line with narrow eyes. He had the look of a lifelong hunter, not the weekend trophy kind, but the kind who understood the transaction between predator and prey on a level most people never consider. He carried a Remington 700 in a canvas case and moved with deliberate patience. Pamela Diaz was the youngest woman at 39 and moved with restless energy. She was Jeffrey's daughter-in-law, and she had come because she had been promising herself a real wilderness experience for years. Gary Hayes, 74, walked with a slight limp from a knee replacement, but his eyes were sharp and he carried himself with the unhurried dignity of a man who had outlived most of his regrets. Ruth Myers, 61, was Gary's companion of many years, quiet in the way that suggested she was always listening, always measuring. I liked them. That is important to say, because what happened to them deserves to be told by someone who saw them as people first. I watched them shoulder their packs and move up the trail in single file, Ronald at the front, Jeffrey at the rear. The last thing I saw was Ruth glancing back over her shoulder, raising one hand in a small wave, before the trail bent around a stand of hemlock and swallowed her. That was the last time I saw all 6 of them alive. Their intended campsite was a clearing beside Dogbone Creek, roughly 7 miles from the trailhead and about 400 feet below the main ridge. It was a good site. Flat ground, reliable water source, natural windbreak from a granite outcropping on the north side. I had camped there myself dozens of times over the years. The only thing unusual about it was its proximity to what the old-timers in the area called the Fold. The Fold was not on any official map. It was simply a name that mountain people used to describe a section of backcountry where the hollows ran together in a way that created a natural maze. Ridgelines converged, valleys narrowed, the forest grew so dense and so ancient that the light took on a greenish tint even at noon. Compasses behaved strangely there. Sound traveled in ways that defied the terrain. Experienced woodsmen found themselves walking in circles. I did not mention the Fold to Ronald when he signed his permit. There was nothing official to say about it. No restricted area designation, no hazard warning, No documented reason to discourage travel in that direction. Just stories, and a ranger who trades in stories rather than facts does not keep his position for long. But the stories were persistent. They had been told in those mountains for as long as anyone could remember, passed down through families whose roots in Appalachian soil went back to the first European settlers and, before that, to the indigenous peoples who had navigated those ridges for thousands of years. The Cherokee had a name for what lived in the fold, though the word does not translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation, the one that stuck and got repeated in hunting camps and church suppers and late-night conversations on front porches throughout the region, was beastmen. The beastmen were not Bigfoot. They were not skinwalkers or Wendigo. They were something else entirely. The old accounts described them with a specificity that always unsettled me, because the details were too consistent across too many sources to be invention. They walked upright, like men, 7 feet tall, some accounts said taller, thick with muscle under skin that was sometimes described as covered in coarse hair and sometimes as bare and gray, like the hide of something that had never seen sunlight. Their faces were the worst part. Almost human. Almost. The brow too heavy, the jaw too wide, the eyes set too far apart and reflecting light the way a predator's eyes reflect light when caught by a beam after sunset. They were not animals wearing the shape of men. They were something that had taken the idea of a man and rebuilt it for a purpose that had nothing to do with civilization. I did not believe in the beastmen, not then. I wish my disbelief had made a difference. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later, Saturday morning. I was running a routine patrol along the upper trail when I found a section of forest that looked wrong. The trees were intact. The trail was clear. But the feel of the place had changed. The air carried a musk, thick and sour, like the smell of a large animal's den, but concentrated in a way that suggested not one animal, but many. The smell of something that lived in groups and stayed in one place long enough to saturate the soil and the bark and the air with its presence. I found tracks near the creek, crossing a 1/4 mile from the group's campsite. They were pressed deep into the mud and shaped like human footprints, but far too large. The stride between them was longer than any person could produce at a walk. The toes were splayed wide, almost prehensile, as if designed for gripping terrain. I counted 7 distinct sets moving toward the fold. I radioed the outpost and reported large animal tracks of indeterminate origin near an occupied campsite. Then I followed the trail toward Dogbone Creek. The camp was intact, tents standing, gear organized, fire ring holding ash only hours old. Food hung properly in bear bags, everything as it should be, except no one was there. And except for the marks on the trees, something had clawed 3 hemlock trees at the edge of the clearing. 4 parallel gouges in each trunk, deep, spaced at intervals matching a large hand with fingers extended. The sap was still fresh and sticky. I stood in that empty camp, alone, and I listened. The forest was silent. Not quiet. Silent. No birds calling from the canopy. No insects humming in the undergrowth. No wind moving through the branches overhead. Just the faint sound of the creek over its stones and the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. In 11 years of backcountry work, I had never experienced a silence that complete. The woods are never truly quiet. There is always something alive and making sound. When the sound stops, it means something else is present, something that every other creature in the vicinity has recognized as a threat and responded to by going still and small and hoping not to be noticed. Then I heard something move in the rhododendron thicket across the clearing. Not a rustle. Not the careless movement of a deer. This was deliberate. The sound of something large moving with calculated slowness, placing each step with the patience of a predator that knows it does not need to rush. I put my hand on my sidearm and called out. I identified myself. I asked whoever was in the brush to make themselves known. The movement stopped. Then, from somewhere deeper in the timber, I heard a voice. It was not speaking to me. It was not speaking any language I recognized. A low rhythmic vocalization between a chant and a growl, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested communication. Something was talking to something else. And whatever they were discussing, they were doing it in the woods between me and the place where 6 people had been sleeping the night before. I backed out of that clearing without turning around. I did not run. I walked with my hand on my weapon and my eyes on the shadows between the trunks, and I did not stop until the canopy opened enough to let the sky back in. I found them the next morning. 4 of them. Ronald, Brenda, Pamela, and Ruth were huddled at a rocky overlook 2 miles northeast of their campsite, heading away from the fold. No packs, no supplies. Pamela was missing 1 boot. Ruth had a gash across her left forearm wrapped with torn fabric. Brenda was sitting against a boulder, staring at nothing, unresponsive. Ronald spoke first. His voice was flat. Not calm. Flat. The way a voice sounds when every emotion has been exhausted and nothing remains but the bare mechanics of forming words. "They took Gary and Jeffrey," he said. "They came out of the ground. I know how that sounds. But they came out of the ground. Now, if you are still listening and you have not yet taken a moment to leave a like or subscribe, I would appreciate it if you would do so now. What comes next is difficult to tell, and I want to know that the people hearing this want the full truth. I got them water. I redressed Ruth's wound. I radioed for extraction and gave coordinates. Then I sat and listened. The first night at Dogbone Creek had been uneventful. The only notable thing was a smell Gary had commented on before bed. Heavy. Animal. He had chalked it up to a bear den somewhere upwind. The second night was when things changed. Jeffrey had been sitting with the fire around midnight when he heard movement in the trees. He was a hunter. He knew what bears, deer, and coyotes sounded like moving through brush. This was different. Bipedal. Heavy. Circling the camp in a wide arc with a consistent distance, as if studying them. He woke Ronald. They sat together, listening to whatever was out there, make its slow, patient orbit. It circled for over an hour. Then it stopped. Then there were 2. Then 3. Ronald could track them by sound, distinct footfalls moving at different speeds, but maintaining a coordinated pattern that suggested not random behavior, but organized surveillance. Jeffrey loaded his rifle. They woke the others quietly and told them to stay in their tents and stay silent. The circling continued until roughly 3 in the morning, then stopped all at once, as if someone had given a command. The forest returned to normal. Jeffrey stayed up until dawn. The next day, they found the claw marks on the trees. They found the tracks by the creek. Brenda examined the tracks and said quietly that nothing she had ever seen made prints like that. They debated leaving. They voted. 4-2 in favor of staying 1 more night. Jeffrey and Pamela argued that the activity was most likely unusual bear behavior. That was the decision that cost them. The second night, Saturday into Sunday, was clear and warm. The moon was nearly full, and it filled the clearing with a pale silver light that turned the hemlock trunks to gray columns and cast long geometric shadows across the ground. They kept the fire large, feeding it steadily, building it into a blaze that threw light 30 feet in every direction and sent sparks spiraling up into the canopy where they died among the branches. Jeffrey sat with his rifle across his knees. Ronald positioned himself between the tents and the tree line with a hatchet and a headlamp. The others stayed close, no one willing to move beyond the ring of firelight. The circling began around 11, closer this time, and this time they could see shapes moving between the trees. Ruth described them in the fewest words of anyone. They looked like men who had forgotten how to be men. Tall, impossibly tall, moving through the timber with a fluidity that did not match their size. Their limbs were long, longer than proportion should allow, and they moved with a gait that was almost human, but subtly, horribly wrong. The joints bent at angles that defied normal anatomy. The arms swung in a rhythm close to human walking, but offset by a fraction of a second, creating an effect that Ruth called mimicry. Something that had learned how to move like a man, but had not learned it from being one. The moonlight caught their skin. Gray. The heads were large, skulls heavy and sloped, faces wide and flat with deep ridges above the eyes. When they turned, their eyes reflected the light with a pale greenish luminescence that made everyone in that clearing understand. on a level deeper than reason, that they were being assessed by something intelligent. Jeffrey sighted on the nearest shape through his scope, about 40 yards out. He told me later he could see it clearly, its mouth slightly open, and the teeth inside were not the teeth of an omnivore. They were the teeth of something that consumed meat raw, and had been doing so for a very long time. He did not fire. He said something stopped him. Not fear. A recognition in the oldest part of his brain that firing would not end the encounter. It would escalate it. He said looking through that scope was like looking into the eyes of something that had been killing in those mountains since before his ancestors crossed the ocean, and it was not afraid of him. It was deciding about him. They stood like that for what felt like the rest of their natural lives. Then the shapes withdrew. Not quickly. They simply turned and moved back into the deeper timber with that wrong fluid gait, and the forest closed behind them. No one slept. At first light they packed. The decision was unanimous and unspoken. They were on the trail by 7. They had covered about 1.5 miles when Gary stopped. He was looking at the ground. A section of trail, perhaps 3 feet across, had been excavated from below, pushed upward and outward, leaving a shallow depression ringed by red clay and torn root fibers. It looked like something had dug its way out from underneath. There were more ahead. 5 excavations, spaced at irregular intervals, each a shallow eruption of earth suggesting something below the surface had forced its way up and into the woods above. The soil around each one carried that same thick, sour musk. Jeffrey knelt beside one, examined it in silence, then stood, checked his rifle, and said one word: "Move." They moved fast, not fast enough. The attack came from the right, from a mountain laurel thicket so dense nothing should have been able to move through it silently. But there was no noise, just sudden, explosive movement, and then something was among them. Ronald's account of the next 60 seconds is fragmented. He remembers something tall and gray coming through the laurel like it was not there. Brenda screaming, Jeffrey turning and firing once, the shot enormous in the close timber, and the creature jerking sideways from the impact, but not falling. Not falling. Jeffrey fired again, and the thing made a vocalization, low and resonant and carrying a vibration Ronald said he felt in his chest. Then there were more of them, both sides of the trail, behind, moving with that horrible fluidity, covering distance in strides too long and too fast for anything that size. Gary went down first. He was at the back of the group, his bad knee finally giving out at the worst possible moment, and something caught him before he hit the ground. Ronald saw it. He saw a hand, gray and enormous, with fingers that wrapped nearly all the way around Gary's upper arm, close with a grip that made the old man cry out in a voice Ronald had never heard from him before. Gary was pulled sideways off the trail and into the brush as if he weighed nothing at all, his boots leaving furrows in the soft earth for 3 feet before the undergrowth swallowed him. Ruth screamed his name. She lunged after him. Pamela caught her around the waist and held her back with everything she had. The sounds that came from the brush where Gary had disappeared lasted only a few seconds. They were brief and wet and final, and Ruth stopped struggling when she heard them. Jeffrey was still firing, methodical, controlled. But there were too many. One came from his blind side and hit him across the back with something long and heavy. His rifle clattered into the underbrush. The thing gathered him up almost casually and carried him into the trees. Ronald grabbed Ruth. Pamela grabbed Brenda. They ran. Off the trail because the trail was no longer safe. Through thorns, over deadfall, not looking back because looking back meant stopping, and stopping meant dying. They ran until Pamela lost her boot, until Ruth caught her arm on a branch, until they reached the overlook and the open sky and the illusion that open ground meant safety. They huddled there through the night. No one slept. No one spoke. They sat together and listened to the forest below and waited for something to come up the slope and finish what had started. Nothing came. The extraction team arrived by mid-afternoon. 2 rangers, a paramedic, a county sheriff's deputy who kept watching the tree line. We got the group to the trailhead and transported them to a community health center 40 minutes down the mountain. Ruth's arm required stitches. Pamela had lacerations on both feet. Brenda had not spoken a word and was assessed as being in acute psychological shock. Ronald was physically intact, but his hands would not stop shaking, a tremor that persisted for weeks. A search and rescue operation was initiated for Gary Hayes and Jeffrey Griffin that afternoon. I led one of the ground teams, 6 people, GPS, satellite phones, 2 tracking dogs, 48-hour supplies. We entered the backcountry at 1400 hours and made for the Dogbone Creek campsite. The camp was gone, not packed up, not dismantled. Gone. The tents, the bear bags, the fire ring stones, every piece of equipment that the group had abandoned in their flight had been removed. The clearing looked as if no human being had ever set foot there, as if the forest had simply absorbed everything and returned to its original state. The only evidence was the claw marks on the hemlocks, still weeping sap, and the tracks by the creek. Where I had counted 7 sets 2 days earlier, there were now dozens. The mud was churned and trampled by a large number of heavy bipedal creatures using the crossing repeatedly. The dogs behaved badly from the moment we entered the search area. Both were experienced bloodhounds with years of search and rescue work, and both refused to follow the trail toward the fold. They whined, they circled, they pressed against their handlers. One of them, a 7-year-old female named Copper, who had tracked lost hikers through blizzards without hesitation, sat on the trail and began to howl. Not bark, howl. A long, mournful sound that rose through the canopy and echoed off the ridgeline as if the mountains themselves were grieving. We pushed forward without the dogs. The handlers stayed behind with them, and the remaining 4 of us continued along the trail in the direction Ronald had described the group fleeing from. We found the excavation sites. 5 holes in the trail, exactly as described, partially filled in since the encounter. The soil had been pushed back deliberately, packed down by something with hands, the surface scraped smooth. We found Jeffrey Griffin's rifle 200 yards past the last excavation site. It was lying in the undergrowth beside the trail, the stock cracked from impact, the bolt open and the chamber empty. There were 4 spent casings within a 10-foot radius, consistent with the rapid, controlled fire that Ronald had described. There was no blood near the rifle. There was no blood anywhere on the trail. Whatever had taken Jeffrey and Gary had done so without leaving the kind of evidence that a violent physical encounter should produce. This detail was noted in my report and has never been adequately explained. We continued deeper, past where the maintained trail gave way to game paths, and the game paths gave way to unmarked forest floor. The canopy closed like a ceiling. The temperature dropped noticeably, which should not have been possible given the elevation and time of year. The smell returned, amplified to a degree that made my eyes water. At approximately 16:30 hours, we reached the fold. The forest did not change gradually. It changed at a line. On one side, normal Appalachian species growing in expected density. On the other side, the same species, but older. Vastly older. Trunks so thick 2 men could not have joined hands around them. Bark furrowed and blackened by centuries of exposure. Roots erupting from the soil in massive tangles that created cavities and tunnels beneath the forest floor. No understory, no shrubs, no saplings, just immense trunks rising from bare earth, and between them, a stillness so complete I could hear the pulse of the man standing next to me. We did not cross the line. No one gave the order. It was simply understood. They were standing among the trees, not hiding, standing, upright, motionless, arranged in a loose semicircle at perhaps 60 yards, partially obscured by the trunks, but visible enough that their shape and scale was unmistakable. I counted 9. There may have been more behind them. They were exactly as Ruth had described, tall, gray, built with a density of muscle that suggested physical capability far beyond the known fauna of the region. Their faces were visible in the fractured light, and those faces settled every question I had ever had about whether the stories were true. Almost human, bone structure, recognizable, eyes, nose, mouth, jaw, all present. all in approximately the correct positions, but the proportions were wrong in a way that created an effect I can only describe as deeply offensive to the human perceptual system. The brow a shelf of bone casting the eyes into permanent shadow, the jaw too wide, projecting forward with an almost canine quality. The eyes small and deeply set and reflecting the light with that pale greenish sheen I had dismissed as embellishment in the old accounts. They were not embellishing. They were being precise. One of them moved. It shifted its weight from one leg to the other, a small adjustment, almost human in its casualness, and the movement caused the others to orient toward it slightly, the way a group of people will turn toward a speaker at a meeting. Then it vocalized. That same low, rhythmic sound I had heard at the campsite 2 days earlier. The chant that was not quite a chant and the growl that was not quite a growl, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested deliberate meaning. The others responded, a chorus of low frequencies that I felt in my sternum and in my teeth and in the base of my skull, vibrating through the still air with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. They were communicating, discussing us, deciding what to do about the 4 humans standing at the edge of their territory with rifles and radios, and the sudden terrifying certainty that neither meant anything in that place. I called the withdrawal. We backed out, maintaining visual contact with the tree line for as long as possible. We did not stop until we reached the gravel lot and the vehicles and the world that made sense. Gary Hayes and Jeffrey Griffin were never found. The search continued for 11 days. Aerial surveys, canine teams, thermal imaging, volunteer ground searches covering hundreds of square miles. Nothing. No remains, no clothing, no biological evidence. The official report classified them as missing, presumed dead, cause undetermined. The case remains open. The file sits in a cabinet in a district office in West Virginia, and no one has looked at it in years. I requested a transfer after that summer. I was reassigned to a district in the western part of the state, flat river country. No ridgelines, no hollows, no ancient forest where things that should not exist stood in the shadows and watched with eyes that glowed green in the failing light. Ronald Simmons went home to Virginia and never entered the woods again. Brenda Russell recovered after several weeks, but refused to discuss the events with anyone. She told her sister that some things were not meant to be spoken about. Pamela Diaz filed a detailed, written account with the county sheriff's office matching everything I have told you. She also filed a request for a formal investigation into what she described as an organized predatory species operating in the Appalachian backcountry. The request was acknowledged. No investigation was conducted. Ruth Myers mourned Gary quietly. She attended a memorial service at a church in Lexington, Kentucky, and laid flowers at the base of a marker bearing his name and the dates of his birth and his disappearance, because without remains there could be no confirmation, and without confirmation there could be no proper grave. I think about them. I think about Gary's sharp eyes and his steady, unhurried way of moving through the world. I think about the limp he never complained about, and the double-knotted laces, and the way he looked at Ruth when he thought no one was watching, with the quiet gratitude of a man who knew exactly how fortunate he was to have someone beside him in the later chapters of his life. I think about Jeffrey's patience, the way he studied the tree line that first night with the same focus he probably brought to every hunt he had ever been on. I think about the last thing Jeffrey did, which was methodically fire his rifle at creatures that did not fall, protecting people he cared about with the only tool he had available, even though he must have understood that it was not going to be enough. I think about the fold, the line where the forest changes and the trees grow old and massive and the ground opens and things come out that the world is not ready to acknowledge. The beastmen let us go that day. I do not know why. I do not know what calculus operates behind those greenish eyes, what criteria determine who walks out of the woods and who does not. I know only that they chose, and their choice is the only reason I am here telling you this instead of being another name on another report in another cabinet that no one will ever open. The boots I found on the trail. Gary's boots. Ruth identified them from a photograph. She looked at it for a long time, then said, "He always double-knotted his laces." He said it was the only way to keep them from coming undone on rough ground. The laces were double-knotted, the care of a man who paid attention to small things, who understood that preparation and diligence were the foundation of safety in the wild. He was right about that. He was right about almost everything. He was wrong about the smell. It was not a bear. I have not been back to the Monongahela corridor since 2019. I will not go back. Not only because I am afraid, though I am permanently afraid, but because going back would mean crossing the line again, stepping into the space where those ancient trees stand in silence and the beastmen wait in their patient, terrible stillness. And I am not certain they would let me go a second time. This is my account. I have told it as accurately as memory and language allow. I have not embellished. I have not dramatized. I have reported what I saw and what I was told by people who had no reason to lie and every reason to wish that what happened to them had not happened. The Appalachian backcountry is vast and old and full of things that do not appear in any field guide or wildlife database. The mountains keep their secrets with the patience of stone and the indifference of deep time. And in the hollows where the ridgelines converge and the forest grows ancient and the light turns green and strange, there are things standing among the trees that have been there since before the word human meant anything at all. If you go into those woods, go carefully. And if the ground looks wrong, if the air smells like something vast and biological and old, if the dogs will not move and the birds have gone silent and the forest watches you with a patience that has no end, turn around, do not cross the line, walk away, and do not look back. Some of us were lucky enough to walk away. Not all of us were. The dead do not rest in the hollows of Appalachia. I know this because I watched them walk. If you are listening to this right now, somewhere in the quiet of your room, or maybe with headphones pressed tight against your ears while the world outside carries on as though nothing is wrong, I need you to understand something before I begin. What I am about to tell you is not a campfire story. It is not something I pulled from some old book of legends or stitched together from whispered rumors. I lived through it. 6 people walked into those mountains with me. Not all of them came back. And the ones who did, well, we have not been the same since. My name does not matter, but what I do for a living does. I have spent the better part of 19 years working the backcountry trails of the southern Appalachian range. I know every ridge, every creek bed, every fire road between the smoky foothills and the high balds that stare out over nothing but fog and silence. I have pulled lost hikers from gorges so deep the sunlight does not reach the bottom until noon. I have tracked missing persons through laurel thickets so dense you could lose a grown man at arm's length. I have seen bears tear apart campsites, watched lightning split trees wide open like bones cracking, and I once found a man who had been dead for 3 weeks, sitting upright against a hemlock, as though he had simply decided to stop walking and never start again. None of that frightened me the way this did. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If you have made it this far into the recording and you have not yet left a like or hit that subscribe button, I would appreciate it if you did that now. It helps more than you know, and honestly, after what I am about to describe, I could use the reminder that there are people out there willing to listen. It was the 2nd week of June. The mountains were thick with the smell of rhododendron blooms and wet earth. The kind of warmth that does not burn but wraps itself around you, like a damp cloth. I had been assigned to guide a small group through a section of trail that the service had recently reopened after a series of unexplained incidents the previous autumn. The official reports called them animal encounters. The unofficial conversations in the ranger station called them something else entirely. The group was made up of 6 civilians. I will tell you about each of them because you deserve to know who they were before the mountains took what they took. Ronald Simmons was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been set by a man who did not believe in gentle angles. He was a contractor from outside Knoxville, the kind of man who built things with his hands and trusted the strength of his own grip more than any rope or harness. He had a voice like gravel turning in a metal drum, and he laughed at things that were not funny, which I later realized was his way of keeping fear at a distance. Brenda Russell was 57. She had the kind of face that made you think of kitchens and Sunday mornings, but her eyes were something different. They were watchful. She had been a county clerk for 30 years and had hiked these mountains since she was a girl growing up in Irwin, Tennessee. She knew the old stories, not the ones they print in the tourism brochures, but the real ones, the ones grandmothers whispered to children who would not stay in bed. Jeffrey Griffin was the oldest active hiker I had ever guided. 66 years old and built like a fence post that had refused to rot. He was a retired surveyor who had mapped half the hollows in western North Carolina during the 1980s. He walked with a slight hitch in his left knee but never complained about it. He carried a leather journal in his chest pocket and wrote in it every evening, recording distances and elevations with the precision of a man who believed the world could be understood if you just measured it carefully enough. Pamela Diaz was 39. She was the quietest of the group, and that should have told me something. She had dark hair pulled back in a single braid, and a way of standing at the edge of conversations, as though she were listening to something the rest of us could not hear. She told me on the first night that she worked as a grief counselor in Asheville. She said she came to the mountains to remember how to breathe. I did not understand what she meant until later. Gary Hayes was 74, the oldest in the group by nearly a decade. He moved slowly but deliberately, the way old water moves through limestone. Every step was a decision. He wore a fishing vest covered in hooks and lures even though we were nowhere near fishable water, and when I asked him about it, he just said, "Old habits do not die. They just find new pockets." He had been a machinist his whole life, retired now, and his hands were permanently curved as though they were still holding tools that were no longer there. Ruth Myers was 61. She had a wide open face and a voice that carried across clearings without effort. She was a former school teacher from a small town in Virginia, whose name I can never remember, and she had the habit of narrating everything she saw as though she were reading aloud from a nature guide. "That birch is dying from the inside. Those clouds are cirrus, not cumulus. That is a copperhead track, not a rat snake." She was almost always right, which made the moments when she was wrong all the more unsettling. We set out on a Tuesday morning from a trailhead that does not appear on most civilian maps. The service had gated it off years ago after a pair of ridge runners reported finding something along the upper switchbacks that they refused to describe in their written incident reports. They filed their paperwork with a single line in the narrative section that read, "Trail compromised. Do not reopen without armed escort." Both of them transferred to different parks within the month. The trail climbed through a corridor of old-growth hemlock, the kind of trees that make you feel like you are walking through a cathedral that was never meant for worship. The canopy was so dense above us that the light came down in thin, broken shafts, and the air beneath the trees had a weight to it that pressed against your chest. We made good time that first day. Ronald set a strong pace at the front, and Gary, despite his age, kept up without visible strain. Brenda walked beside me for most of the morning, and somewhere around the 3rd-mile marker, she asked me a question that I did not expect. "Have you ever heard of the corpse walker?" I told her I had not. She nodded slowly, as though she had anticipated that answer, and then she said something that I wrote down later because I did not want to forget it. My grandmother called it the hollow mover. She said it walks the ridges at night carrying the dead on its back like firewood. She said if you see it from far away, it looks like a person hiking alone. But if you get close, you can see that the person it is carrying is not luggage. It is a body, and the body is looking at you. I smiled at the time. I should not have. We set up camp that first night in a clearing about 6 miles in, near a creek that ran clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. Jeffrey pulled out his journal and began sketching the topography. Ruth identified every tree within a 100-yard radius. Pamela sat on a fallen log and stared into the water without blinking. Ronald built the fire. Gary sat in his camp chair and told stories about the old mills that used to run along these creeks before the park swallowed the land. It was a good evening, the kind that makes you believe the mountains are generous. The first sign that something was wrong came after midnight. I was in my tent, not sleeping but not fully awake either, caught in that gray corridor between consciousness and wherever consciousness goes when it lets go. I heard footsteps. Not the soft, padded footfalls of an animal. These were deliberate, heavy, the kind of footsteps that belong to something walking upright on 2 legs, carrying weight. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. The fire had burned down to a low ring of coals that threw almost no light. The trees stood like black columns against a sky choked with clouds. I could not see the stars. I could not see much of anything. But I could hear those footsteps, slow and rhythmic, moving along the tree line on the far side of the clearing. I reached for my flashlight and swept the beam across the edge of the woods. Nothing. The footsteps stopped the moment the light touched the trees, as though whatever was making them had simply ceased to exist. I sat there for a long time listening. The creek continued its quiet conversation with the stones. An owl called from somewhere deep in the canopy. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had heard a deer, or maybe a black bear, passing through on its nightly rounds. I went back to my sleeping bag and pulled it up to my chin like a child hiding from something it does not want to name. In the morning, I found the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft earth along the perimeter of our camp, starting at the northern edge of the clearing and following a curved path that circled us completely before disappearing into the underbrush on the southern side. The tracks were human in shape but wrong in proportion. The heel print was too narrow, the toe spread too wide, and the stride length was nearly 5 feet, which would require legs far longer than any person I have ever encountered. But the worst detail, the one that made the skin along my forearms tighten, was that the tracks came in pairs. 2 sets of prints, side by side, moving in perfect unison. One set walked normally, the other set dragged. The toes of the dragging prints pointed backward as though whatever was being moved was being carried face up, with its feet trailing behind it. I did not tell the group about the tracks. I covered them with loose soil and dead leaves before anyone else woke up. That was my first mistake. It would not be my last. We broke camp and moved deeper into the mountains. The trail narrowed as we gained elevation, and the hemlock gave way to a mixed forest of oak and birch that rattled in a wind I could not feel at ground level. Jeffrey was the first to notice the silence. "Where are the birds?" He was right. Since we had started walking that morning, I had not heard a single bird call. No woodpeckers hammering at the dead wood. No warblers threading their songs through the understory. No ravens barking from the high branches. The forest was holding its breath. Pamela stopped walking and turned her head slowly from side to side, scanning the trees with an expression I had seen before on the faces of people who were trying to locate the source of a sound that should not exist. She looked at me, and for the first time since the trip began, she spoke directly. "Something is following us." I told her it was probably a black bear keeping its distance. She shook her head. "Bears do not make the forest go quiet like this. Bears are part of the forest. Whatever is out there, the forest does not recognize it." Ronald laughed his gravel laugh and said Pamela had been reading too many horror novels. Gary adjusted a lure on his vest and said nothing. Brenda looked at me with those watchful eyes, and I knew she was thinking about her grandmother's story. We pushed on. The trail rose sharply around noon, climbing a series of switchbacks that carved through a hillside of exposed shale. The rock was slick with moisture that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than from any visible source of water. Ruth slipped once, catching herself on a root, and when she pulled her hand away, she said the root was warm. I touched it myself. She was right. The root was warm, as though something beneath the ground was generating heat. By 3 o'clock we reached the upper ridge. The view should have been spectacular. On a clear day, you can see 5 counties from that elevation, a rolling green tapestry stitched with roads and rivers and the occasional silver flash of a tin roof catching the sun. But that afternoon, the view was gone. A fog had settled into the valleys below us, and it was not the ordinary mountain fog that burns off by mid-morning. This fog was thick and low and yellow at the edges, and it moved against the wind. Brenda stood at the overlook and stared down into it. I watched her face change. The color left her cheeks the way water leaves a cloth when you wring it. "That is not fog," she said. "That is breath." No one laughed. We made made camp on the ridge that evening because I did not want to descend into whatever was filling the valleys. The wind was stronger up there, and it carried a smell that I could not identify. It was not the clean mineral smell of mountain air. It was not the organic rot of a dead animal. It was somewhere between the two, as though something that had once been alive was being preserved in a state that was neither death nor decomposition, but something worse. A suspension. A waiting. Jeffrey wrote in his journal until the light failed. Ronald built another fire, but this time it did not catch easily. The wood was damp and the flames sputtered and hissed, as though the fire itself was reluctant to exist in that place. Gary sat in his chair and stared at the tree line without speaking, his curved hands resting on his knees. It was Ruth who saw it first. She was standing at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the fog-filled valley, when she made a sound I had never heard a human being make before. It was not a scream. It was not a gasp. It was the sound of someone whose breath has been stolen, a vacuum where a voice should be, followed by a single word spoken in a whisper that somehow carried across the entire clearing. Walking. I was beside her in seconds. I looked down into the valley, and what I saw will remain behind my eyes until the day I stop seeing anything at all. There was a figure moving through the fog below us. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved with a gait that was both fluid and broken, like a marionette being operated by someone who understood the mechanics of walking, but had never actually seen it done. Its limbs bent at angles that did not correspond to any skeleton I knew, and on its back, draped across its shoulders like a hunter carrying a deer carcass, was a body, a human body. The body's arms hung down on one side, swaying with each step, and its head lolled on the other, the face turned upward toward the ridge where we stood. Even from that distance, even through the fog, I could see that the body's eyes were open. They were looking at us. The figure stopped. It turned its head, slowly, in our direction. I could not see its face, not clearly, but I could feel it seeing me. That is the only way I can describe it. The act of being observed by something that should not have the capacity for observation. Then it continued walking, carrying its burden deeper into the fog, until the yellow mist swallowed them both and the valley was empty again. No one slept that night. We sat around the fire in a circle, 6 civilians and 1 ranger, and we did not speak. The fire burned low and blue, and the wind carried that smell again, that terrible smell of suspension and waiting, and somewhere far below us, in the hollows where the fog pooled like standing water, I could hear footsteps, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The dead were walking, and they were coming closer. I radioed the station at first light. The response I received was static, and a single broken phrase that sounded like "do not," followed by a word I could not make out. I tried 3 more times. Each attempt produced the same result: static, fragments, silence. The radio was not malfunctioning, the batteries were fresh, and the antenna was intact. Something between us and the station was interrupting the signal, and I did not want to think about what that something might be. The group gathered around the cold remains of the fire. Their faces carried the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained terror. The eyes were open but unfocused. The mouths were set in lines that were not quite frowns, but were no longer capable of forming anything else. Ronald, who had laughed at everything for the first 2 days, was not laughing anymore. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his head down, staring at his own hands, as though he had just noticed they were attached to him. "We need to go back," he said. I agreed. The plan had been to continue along the ridge for another day before descending through the eastern drainage and looping back to the trailhead. But plans are suggestions you make to the mountains, and the mountains are under no obligation to cooperate. I told the group we would retrace our route back to the lower trail and move toward the trailhead as quickly as the terrain would allow. Brenda was the first to raise a concern. She pulled me aside while the others packed their gear and spoke in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear her. "The fog is still in the valleys. If we go down, we go into it." I looked over the edge of the ridge. She was right. The fog had not lifted with the morning sun. If anything, it had thickened overnight. filling the hollows and creek beds below us with a dense, yellowish vapor that moved in slow, rolling currents like something alive and breathing. "We do not have a choice," I told her. "We cannot stay up here. There is no water source on the ridge, and the next resupply point is 12 miles in the wrong direction." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I did not understand at the time, but that I have thought about every day since. "The walker does not hunt. It collects. There is a difference, and if you do not understand it before we reach the bottom, it will not matter." We descended. The switchbacks that had been merely slippery on the way up were treacherous on the way down. The shale was covered in a thin film of moisture that smelled faintly of copper, and the roots that jutted from the hillside were still warm to the touch. The air grew heavier as we dropped in elevation, and the silence that had swallowed the birdsong the day before had now extended to everything. No insects, no wind through the leaves, no creek sounds. The forest was not just quiet. It was mute, as though the capacity for sound had been surgically removed from the landscape. Gary was the first to fall behind. His deliberate, measured pace could not keep up with the urgency that was driving the rest of us downhill. I dropped back to walk with him, and as we moved together through a corridor of birch trees whose bark was peeling in long white strips, he spoke for the first time since the previous evening. "I have seen that thing before." I asked him what he meant. 50 years ago. I was a young man working the second shift at a machine shop in Weaverville. One night I was driving home along a back road that ran through the gap between two ridges. It was late. There was no moon, and something walked across the road in front of my truck. He paused. His curved hands tightened on the straps of his pack. It was carrying a woman. She was dead. I could tell because her arms hung like ropes and her head was at an angle that living necks do not allow. But her eyes were open. And when the thing carrying her turned to look at my headlights, I saw its face. "What did it look like?" I asked. He shook his head. It did not have a face. It had a place where a face should be, like a hole in the shape of a person. And inside the hole there was nothing, not shadow, not emptiness. Nothing. The kind of nothing that looks back at you. We caught up with the others at the base of the switchbacks where the trail leveled out and entered the hemlock corridor we had passed through on the first day. The fog was waiting for us there. It lapped at the edges of the trail like shallow water, knee-high and dense enough to obscure our own feet as we walked. Jeffrey was consulting his journal, comparing the distances he had recorded on the way in with the landmarks around us. His face was troubled. "We should have reached the creek crossing by now," he said. "According to my measurements, it is 1.7 miles from the base of the switchbacks. We have been walking for over an hour. The terrain is level. We should be there." He was right. The creek crossing, where the trail forded a shallow run of clear water over smooth stones, should have been directly ahead of us. But the trail continued on through the hemlocks without any sign of water, and the fog grew thicker with each step, rising from our knees to our waists, to our chests until we were wading through it like travelers crossing a river made of smoke. Ruth stopped walking. She was standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail, the fog curling around her shoulders, and she was looking at something to our left, deeper in the trees. I followed her gaze and saw what had stopped her. There was a figure standing between two hemlocks about 40 yards off the trail. It was motionless, and at first I thought it was a tree trunk, or a trick of the fog creating the suggestion of a human shape where none existed. But then Pamela, who had been walking behind Ruth, whispered a single word that I felt rather than heard. "Diaz." The figure's name was not Diaz. Pamela's last name was Diaz. She was not identifying the figure. She was responding to it, as though it had called to her. "Pamela, stay on the trail," I said. She took a step toward the trees. I grabbed her arm. She turned and looked at me, and her eyes were not the eyes of a frightened woman. They were the eyes of someone who had just recognized a face in a crowd that they had not expected to see. There was no fear in them. There was relief. "It is my mother," she said. "She has been waiting for me." Pamela's mother, as I learned later, had died 6 years before this trip. She had passed away in a hospice in Asheville after a long illness, and Pamela had been at her bedside when it happened. Pamela had told me on the first night that she worked as a grief counselor. She had not told me that the grief she counseled most was her own. I pulled Pamela back onto the trail and positioned myself between her and the trees. The figure had not moved. It stood in the fog between the hemlocks, and now that I was looking directly at it, I could see that it was not standing at all. It was being held up. There was something behind it, something taller, something that I could not fully resolve in the fog, but that appeared to have too many joints in its arms and a torso that curved forward at an angle that made it look like a question mark written in flesh and bone. The figure being held was a woman. She wore a white garment that might have been a hospital gown, and her feet were bare, and they were not touching the ground. She hung from the thing behind her like a coat on a hook, her arms at her sides, her head tilted slightly forward. Her eyes were open. Pamela began to cry. Not the loud, heaving sobs of panic, but the quiet, continuous weeping of someone who has just been shown something they have spent years trying to forget. Ronald stepped forward and put his body between Pamela and the trees. He was shaking, but his voice was steady when he spoke. That is not her mother. We need to move. Now. We moved. We moved faster than we should have on a trail we could barely see, through fog that resisted our passage like something with texture and weight. Brenda led the way, navigating by instinct and memory, calling out roots and rocks and sudden drops in the trail like a pilot reading instruments in zero visibility. Jeffrey kept his journal open, tracking our pace and direction, trying to reconcile our position with a landscape that no longer matched his measurements. We walked for 2 more hours. The creek crossing never appeared. The trail, which should have been a straight line back to the trailhead, began to curve. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. We were being turned. Something was bending the path beneath our feet, redirecting us deeper into the mountains instead of back toward the road. I called a halt when I recognized a rock formation that we had passed 30 minutes earlier. We were walking in circles. The fog pressed in around us. It was above our heads now, filling the canopy, erasing the sky, turning the world into a gray, featureless room with walls made of nothing and a ceiling that did not exist. The smell was stronger here. That terrible smell of preservation, of a body held in a state between living and dead, suspended in the amber of something that fed on the boundary between the two. Gary sat down on a fallen log and took off his hat. His face was the color of old paper. "It is collecting us," he said. "Just like the stories say. It does not chase. It does not attack. It walks the dead past the living until the living follow. That is how it feeds. Not on the body, on the following. On the moment you step off the trail because you think you recognize someone who is already gone." I asked him how he knew this. He looked at me with eyes that had seen 74 years of a world that he had always known was not entirely what it appeared to be. "Because my wife is out there. She died in 1998. And I have been hearing her voice since we entered these woods. She is calling my name. She has been calling it for 2 days. And every time I hear her, the voice gets a little closer." He put his hat back on and stood up. "The only way out is to stop listening." We gathered ourselves. I checked the compass. It was spinning. Not rapidly, not wildly, but with a slow, deliberate rotation that made it look like the needle was searching for something other than north. I put the compass away and relied on the slope of the terrain. Water flows downhill. If we followed the grade, we would eventually reach a creek bed, and creek beds lead to rivers, and rivers lead to roads. We left the trail. That was the decision that changed everything. Moving through untrailed Appalachian forest is not like walking through a park. The understory is a tangle of rhododendron, mountain laurel, and greenbrier that grabs at your clothing and your skin with thorns and branches that seem to have intent behind them. The ground is uneven, covered in fallen trunks and hidden rocks and holes that can snap an ankle without warning. In fog this thick, every step was a negotiation with a landscape that did not want us to pass. We moved in single file. I led. Brenda was behind me. Then Ruth, then Pamela, then Jeffrey, then Ronald. Gary brought up the rear because he insisted on it, saying that whatever was out there would come from behind, and he would rather see it coming than feel it arrive. For the first 20 minutes, we made progress. The grade was consistent, and I could hear faintly the sound of water somewhere below us. It was not the cheerful babble of a mountain creek. It was a low, sustained murmur, like a voice speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Then Ruth screamed. I turned and found her standing with her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes fixed on something on the ground at her feet. I pushed through the undergrowth to reach her and look down. It was a body, a human body, lying face up in a shallow depression between two oak roots. The body was old, not decomposed, not skeletal, but old in a way that I had never seen before. The skin was intact, but had the texture and color of tanned leather, pulled tight over bones that were visible beneath it like the framework of a collapsed tent. The clothing was shredded and faded beyond any identifiable pattern or color. The hands were curled into fists at the sides. The eyes were open. They were not the clouded, milky eyes of a dead person. They were clear. They were brown. And they were tracking my movement. I stepped back. The body did not move. It lay there in its depression, perfectly still, its leather skin stretched over its ancient bones, its clear brown eyes following me as I retreated. Jeffrey knelt beside the body, and I shouted at him to get back. He ignored me. He opened his journal and compared something on the page with the terrain around us. Then he looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts fascination and horror. This is a known survey point. I mapped this area in 1984. There was a cemetery here, an old one, pre-Civil War. The markers were fieldstones, nothing inscribed. The county records listed 14 burials. He looked back at the body. This is one of them. It has been here for almost 200 years. And it is looking at me. I pulled Jeffrey to his feet and we moved. Behind us, in the fog, I heard the sound of something rising from the ground. The slow, wet, crackling sound of joints that had not been used in a very long time beginning to articulate. The sound of movement returning to a body that had surrendered it generations ago. The dead were rising, and they were walking after us. The sound followed us through the fog. Not footsteps exactly, but the memory of footsteps. The rhythm of a body walking that had forgotten how knees are supposed to bend, how feet are supposed to meet the ground, how weight is supposed to transfer from heel to toe. It was a shuffling, dragging, cracking sound that came from behind us and beside us, and impossibly from ahead. I counted heads. Ronald was there. Brenda was there. Ruth was there, her face white and locked in a grimace that might have been permanent. Pamela was there, though her eyes had taken on a glazed, distant quality that worried me. Jeffrey was there, clutching his journal to his chest like a talisman. Gary was not there. I stopped. I turned. I called his name into the fog and received nothing in return. No answer. No sound of his boots on the forest floor. No creak of his fishing vest or jingle of the lures that hung from its pockets. Gary Hayes, 74 years old, machinist, husband to a woman who had been dead for nearly 30 years, had simply ceased to be present. Ronald wanted to go back. I watched him wrestle with the impulse, his big contractor's hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his jaw working beneath the skin. I understood the instinct. You do not leave someone behind in the woods. That is not how this works. You count heads, and if the count comes up short, you retrace, you search, you call until your voice gives out. That is the rule. But the rules were written for forests that behave like forests. This one had stopped following any logic I recognized. The compass still spun. The trail had vanished behind us as though the ground itself had swallowed it. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see Ronald standing 6 feet away from me, and the sounds from the trees, those shuffling, cracking, dragging sounds, were multiplying. There was not one source anymore. There were several. I could hear them moving through the understory on both sides of our path, keeping pace with us, maintaining a distance that was shrinking with every minute that passed. Gary had heard his wife's voice. He had told me so himself. He had been hearing it for 2 days. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like cold water pouring down the center of my chest, that he had finally followed it. "We cannot go back," I said. Ronald looked at me. I expected anger. I expected the fury of a man who builds things being told to abandon someone. Instead, I saw understanding. And that was worse, because understanding meant he knew what I knew. Gary had not been taken. He had been invited. And he had accepted. We kept moving downhill. The grade steepened and the forest changed. The oaks gave way to a stand of tulip poplars so tall their trunks disappeared into the fog above us like pillars supporting an invisible ceiling. The ground became softer, wetter. My boots sank into a layer of decomposing leaves so deep it reached my shins. The smell was overwhelming now. That smell of arrested decay, of biological processes frozen at the exact moment between life and death, filled my nostrils and my mouth and the back of my throat until I could taste it. Brenda was praying. I could hear her whispering under her breath, the words indistinct but the cadence unmistakable. The rhythm of prayer is universal, a rising and falling pattern that reaches towards something above and then returns to the speaker empty-handed, only to reach again. She had been walking these mountains since childhood. She knew the old stories, and now she was living inside one. Jeffrey stopped walking and held up his hand. We gathered around him. He had his journal open to a page covered in hasty marks and calculations, and he spoke in the flat, measured voice of a man reporting data while his world collapses. We have descended approximately 1,100 feet from the ridge. Based on the grade and the direction of the slope, we should be within a quarter-mile of the old forest road that runs along the base of the mountain. If my measurements are correct, and they have always been correct before, we should hear vehicle traffic or see signs of the road within the next 10 minutes. We did not hear vehicle traffic. We did not see signs of the road. What we found instead was the cemetery. It appeared out of the fog like a memory that the landscape had been trying to suppress. A clearing, roughly circular, bordered by a low wall of stacked fieldstones that were green with moss and leaning inward as though the earth beneath them was slowly breathing. Inside the wall, the ground was bare. No leaves, no undergrowth, no grass. Just exposed soil, pale and smooth with rows of fieldstone markers rising from it at regular intervals. Jeffrey counted them. 14. Exactly the number recorded in the county records he had referenced earlier. But these were not the markers he had surveyed in 1984. Those had been scattered across a hillside nearly a mile from where we now stood. These markers were arranged in perfect rows, as though someone, or something, had gathered them and replanted them here in the bottom of the hollow, along with whatever lay beneath them. There were open graves. 7 of the 14 plots had been disturbed. The soil was pushed upward from below, forming low mounds of pale earth that looked like blisters on the surface of the clearing. At the center of each mound, a hole, not dug from above, pushed through from underneath. The edges of each hole were smooth and curved outward, as though the occupants had simply sat up and climbed out. I stood at the edge of that clearing, and I understood what Brenda had tried to tell me. The corpse walker does not hunt, it collects. The cemetery was its pantry, the bodies were its inventory, and it walked them through the mountains not to frighten the living, but to find them, to show them faces they recognized, voices they remembered, love they had lost, and to lead them back here, to this clearing, where the ground would open and the collection would grow by one. Pamela stepped past me into the clearing. I shouted her name. She did not respond. She walked between the fieldstone markers with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who has finally arrived at a destination they have been traveling toward for years. She stopped at the edge of one of the open graves and looked down into it. "Mama," she said, "I knew you were here. I knew you were waiting." I ran after her. I grabbed her arm and pulled, but she was immovable. Not strong, not resisting, simply rooted. Her feet had sunk into the pale soil up to her ankles, and the ground was holding her. I could feel it through the soles of my own boots, a subtle suction, a gentle downward pressure, as though the earth itself was inhaling. Ronald was there beside me. He grabbed Pamela's other arm and pulled. Brenda was behind us, still praying. Ruth had stopped at the stone wall and was gripping the top of it with both hands, her eyes wide and fixed on something beyond the clearing that I could not see. Then Jeffrey said 3 words that I will hear for the rest of my life. "It is here." I turned. The corpse walker stood at the far edge of the clearing. It was tall. I do not mean tall the way a basketball player is tall or the way a tree is tall. I mean tall in a way that violated the relationship between height and existence. It rose from the ground like a column of vapor given form, its outline wavering at the edges as though it could not fully commit to being solid. Its body was wrong. The torso was too long, the arms too many jointed, the legs bending backward at the knees in a way that made each step look like a controlled fall. It was the color of wet bark, and its surface had the texture of something that had been submerged in water for a very long time, smooth and swollen, and faintly luminous in the fog. It did not have a face. Gary had told me this, and he had been right. Where a face should have been, there was an absence. Not shadow, not emptiness. An active, deliberate void. A place where the concept of a face had been removed so completely that looking at it was like trying to read a word that had been not just erased but unmade. My eyes slid off it. My brain refused to process it. Every part of my training and my instinct screamed at me to look away, and I could not. On its back, draped across its impossible shoulders, were bodies. Not one, not two. I counted 5 before my vision began to blur from the strain of looking at something that was not meant to be looked at. 5 bodies layered across its back like cordwood, their arms hanging, their legs trailing, their heads lolling, and every single one of them had open eyes. Every single one of them was looking at us. I recognized Gary. He was the topmost body on the pile, laid across the others with his fishing vest still covered in hooks and lures. His face was peaceful. His eyes were open and clear. His mouth was curved in a small, contented smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he is reunited with someone he loves after a long separation. He was looking directly at Ronald. Ronald made a sound, low, guttural, the sound of something breaking inside a structure that was never designed to bend. He took a step toward the walker, then another. "No," I said. "Ronald, no." He turned to me, and his face was the face of a man who has just realized that everything he has ever been afraid of was real, and everything he has ever relied on to keep the fear away was a lie. "It has my brother," he said. "Danny. He died when we were kids. He drowned in the French Broad, and I can hear him calling me. He is saying it is okay. He is saying the water is warm." I hit Ronald. I hit him across the face with the flat of my open hand, as hard as I could. His head snapped to the side, and when he looked back at me, his eyes were clear. The glaze was gone. He was Ronald again, the man who built things, the man who laughed to keep the fear away. "Run," he said. We ran. Pamela did not come with us. I tried. I pulled at her arms until I thought her shoulders would separate from her body. Ronald tried. He wrapped his arms around her waist and heaved. She did not move. The ground had taken her to the knees now, and her face wore the same peaceful expression that I had seen on Gary's face, where it rested on the walker's back. She was smiling. She was looking down into the open grave. "I am coming, Mama. I am coming right now. I made the decision that will follow me through every remaining hour of my life." I left her. I turned my back on Pamela Diaz, 39 years old, grief counselor, daughter, and I ran. We ran through the hemlock corridor without thought or direction. Brenda led because she had always led, her feet finding paths that did not exist, her body moving through the undergrowth as though the forest owed her passage and was paying the debt. Ruth ran behind her, silent now, her narration of the natural world abandoned in favor of the simple, animal imperative of flight. Jeffrey ran with his journal clutched to his chest, his bad knee forgotten, his body operating on a fuel source that had nothing to do with calories or oxygen and everything to do with the refusal to stop existing. Ronald ran beside me, his breath coming in great ragged gulps, his face still red from where I had hit him. Behind us, in the fog, the walker followed, not running, walking, that slow, deliberate, broken gait that covered ground without appearing to hurry. It did not need to run. It had been walking these mountains for centuries. It would be walking them long after we were gone. Hurry was a concept that belonged to the living. The walker had no use for it. The fog began to thin. I did not notice it at first because my eyes were fixed on the ground in front of me. searching for roots and rocks and the thousand small traps the forest sets for those who move through it too quickly. But the light changed. The gray, featureless haze that had enclosed us for hours began to develop texture, variation, depth. Shafts of sunlight, actual sunlight, pierced through the canopy and struck the forest floor like spotlights on a stage that had been abandoned. We broke out of the tree line and onto the forest road. I have never experienced a more profound transition. One moment we were inside the fog, surrounded by silence and the smell of suspended death, and the next we were standing on a gravel road bathed in afternoon sunlight, with a red-tailed hawk circling above us and the sound of a truck engine somewhere in the distance. Brenda collapsed. She went down on her knees on the gravel and pressed her palms flat against the stones and wept. Ruth sat beside her, one hand on her back, and stared at the tree line with an expression that combined relief and horror in proportions I have never seen on a human face before or since. Jeffrey opened his journal and made a final entry. I looked over his shoulder later and saw what he had written. A single line. The measurements do not apply. Ronald walked to the center of the road and stood there with his arms at his sides and his head tilted back, letting the sunlight fall on his face. He stood that way for a long time, and when he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet. I flagged down the truck. The driver was a local man hauling firewood who took one look at our faces and asked no questions. He drove us to the nearest ranger station, where I filed a report that I knew would be filed and forgotten, placed in a drawer with other reports that described things the service did not want to acknowledge. The search party that went in the next morning found the trail. They found our campsites. They found the switchbacks and the ridge and the hemlock corridor. They did not find the cemetery. They did not find the open graves. They did not find Gary Hayes or Pamela Diaz. The fog had lifted by then, and the mountains looked the way mountains are supposed to look, green and sunlit and ancient and indifferent. Gary and Pamela were listed as missing persons. The file remains open. It will remain open forever because there is no resolution available that the official record is willing to accept. You cannot write, "Last seen being carried by a creature that walks the dead through the hollows of the southern Appalachian range." You cannot file a report that says, "Victim entered the ground willingly after recognizing a deceased family member displayed on the back of an entity that does not have a face." So you write, "Missing, presumed lost." And you close the folder, and you go home. But you do not sleep. Not really. Because sleep requires a surrender of awareness, a willingness to let the conscious mind go still. And when your conscious mind goes still, you can hear them. The footsteps, slow and rhythmic. The sound of something walking through a forest that is never fully silent, carrying a burden that was once a person, displaying the dead for the living to see. I hear them now, as I record this. They are not loud. They are not close, but they are there, just beneath the threshold of ordinary hearing, moving through the hollows and the ridges and the valleys where the fog collects and the old cemeteries lie hidden beneath layers of leaf litter and time. The corpse walker does not hunt. It collects. And its collection is never complete. Brenda went back to Irwin and never set foot on a trail again. She attends church twice a week now, and has not spoken about what happened since the day it happened. Ruth returned to Virginia and retired from her teaching position. She told me once, in a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes, that she can no longer identify trees. She looks at them and sees columns, just columns, holding up something she cannot see. Jeffrey destroyed his journal. He burned it in the fireplace of his home in Brevard and watched 4 decades of measurements and observations turn to ash. He told me the numbers were wrong. All of them. They had always been wrong. The mountains do not have fixed dimensions. They move, they shift, they rearrange themselves when no one is looking, and the only honest measurement is the one that admits it does not know. Ronald Simmons calls me once a month. We do not discuss the trip. We do not discuss Gary or Pamela or the thing that walked through the fog carrying the dead on its back. We talk about baseball. We talk about the weather. We talk about nothing. Because nothing is the only safe subject when everything else leads back to a clearing in the mountains where the ground was bare and the graves were open and a creature without a face stood at the edge of the fog and waited. I still work the trails. I know I should not. I know that every time I enter the backcountry, I am walking in the same mountains where the walker moves, breathing the same air, stepping on the same soil that opened like a mouth to swallow Pamela Diaz. But this is my work. This is what I do. And if I stop doing it, the fear wins, and I cannot allow that. But I no longer guide groups through the upper sections. I no longer camp above the fog line. And I never, under any circumstances, enter the forest after the light fails. Because that is when it walks. When the ridges go quiet and the fog rises from the hollows and the old cemeteries stir beneath their blankets of earth and time, the corpse walker begins its rounds. It moves from hollow to hollow, ridge to ridge, collecting the dead and carrying them through the mountains, displaying them for the living, whispering in voices that should not exist anymore. And the dead, with their open eyes and their peaceful faces, look at you. They look at you and they smile. And the smile says something that your living mind translates as one simple, terrible word. Follow. Do not follow. Whatever you do, if you are ever in those mountains and you see a figure moving through the fog, carrying something on its back, something that looks like a person, something that looks like someone you once knew and loved and lost, do not follow. Stay on the trail. Keep your eyes forward. And do not listen to the voices of the dead, because the dead do not rest in the hollows of Appalachia. They walk. The radio had been dead for 11 minutes before I noticed. I remember that detail because I had just glanced at the dashboard clock when the static gave way to nothing, and I told myself I would check it again in 10 minutes, and when I finally looked, 21 minutes had passed. That is how the hollow works. It takes your sense of time first. Then it takes everything else. My name does not matter to this story. What matters is what I saw and what I did not do to stop it. I had been working the eastern corridor of the Monongahela section for 9 years at that point, and before that I had spent 4 seasons in the Pisgah district further south. 13 years walking those ridges and hollows had made me believe I understood the Appalachian wilderness the way a man understands the rooms of his own house. That belief nearly cost me my life, and it cost others far more than that. It was June of 2022. The dogwoods had already shed their blossoms, and the canopy was full and green, so thick in places that the forest floor never saw direct sunlight even at noon. I was stationed at the Briarhook trailhead that week, which meant I was responsible for logging hikers in and out, maintaining the fire road as far as the 3rd switchback, and responding to any emergencies within a 12-mile radius. Briarhook is not a popular trail. It does not appear on most commercial hiking apps. The elevation gain is brutal, the trail markings are sparse past the 2-mile marker, and the cell signal dies completely once you descend into the hollow itself. Most summers I would see 30, maybe 40 hikers total for the entire season. Some summers I would see fewer than that. That is why the group of 6 stood out to me immediately. They arrived in 2 vehicles on a Tuesday morning. The first was a silver Chevrolet Tahoe driven by a man named Ryan Ford. He was 35, lean and sunburned, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from spending weekends outdoors, but not truly living in the wild. He wore a technical hiking shirt with the tag still attached and boots that had been purchased recently enough to still smell like the store. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Anna Sullivan, 41, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a notebook she never seemed to close. She was the trip organizer, I would learn. She had found Briarhook in some obscure online forum dedicated to remote Appalachian trails, and she had spent months convincing the others to join her. The second vehicle was a burgundy Ford Explorer, older, with mud on the wheel wells and a faded bumper sticker from a national park I could not read from my position at the trailhead kiosk. The driver was Nicholas Wallace, 58, a retired utilities foreman with thick forearms and a voice that carried across the parking lot without effort. In the back seat sat Cheryl Hamilton, 52, who stepped out of the vehicle already looking at the tree line with an expression I have since come to recognize as instinctive unease. She did not know why she was uneasy. She would not know for another 36 hours, but some part of her understood before any of us did. The last 2 members of the group arrived together from the Explorer. Jacob Graham was 68, tall and slow-moving, with white hair pulled back from his forehead and a walking stick he had carved himself from a piece of hickory. He moved like a man who had earned his years honestly. Joyce Woods was 77 and the oldest of the group by nearly a decade. She was small, sharp-featured, and carried a canvas pack that looked heavier than she should have been able to manage. She was also the only one among them who had been to Briarhook before. I stepped out of the kiosk and met them at the trailhead sign. Standard procedure. I introduced myself, explained the trail conditions, and asked them to sign the register. Ryan signed first, writing quickly and legibly. Anna signed second, adding her emergency contact information without being asked. Nicholas signed with a grunt and a nod. Cheryl hesitated, pen in hand, and looked at me. She said, "Do you get many hikers out here?" I told her the truth. Not many. Briarhook is off the main circuit. Most people heading into this section of the forest take the Seneca Creek Trail or the Spruce Knob Connector. Briarhook dead ends at a geological formation locals call the Jaw, which is a narrow ravine with walls 60 feet high on both sides. There is nothing past the Jaw except more forest and eventually the state line. Cheryl looked at the trees again. She said, "It feels like something is already looking at us." Nicholas laughed and told her she had been reading too many horror novels. But I did not laugh. I had heard that exact sentiment before, sometimes from hikers, sometimes from other rangers. There was something about Briarhook that made people feel observed. I had always attributed it to the acoustics of the hollow, the way sound traveled strangely between the ridges, carrying birdsong and wind in ways that could feel almost conversational. But that morning, standing with those 6 people in the gravel lot, I felt it too. Not just the sense of being watched, the sense of being assessed. Jacob was the last to sign the register. He wrote slowly, carefully, then set the pen down and looked at me with eyes that were pale blue and remarkably steady for a man his age. He said, "You ever hear the old-timers around here talk about what lives in the hollow?" I said I had heard plenty of stories. Every section of the Appalachian range has its legends. The Wampus Cat in the southern stretches, the Flatwoods creature in the Braxton County hills. I had even fielded reports from hikers who swore they had seen something large moving through the trees at night, always just beyond the edge of their headlamp beams. Jacob nodded as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. He said, "The one I am talking about does not have a name that anyone agrees on. But everyone who has seen it agrees on one thing. It has red eyes. Not reflective, not glowing the way an animal's eyes catch light. Red, like something burning behind the pupils, like coals that have not gone out." Joyce, who had been silent up to that point, placed her hand on Jacob's arm. She said, "Save the stories for the campfire, Jake. Let these people enjoy the walk-in first." And so they set off, Ryan leading, Anna just behind him with her notebook, Nicholas and Cheryl walking side by side, Jacob and Joyce bringing up the rear at a slower pace. I watched them until the trail curved and the trees swallowed them. Then I went back to the kiosk and tried the radio again. Still nothing. Just silence where there should have been the comfortable chatter of dispatch. I want to tell you that I felt something definitive in that moment, some premonition or gut instinct that should have made me call them back. But I did not. I wrote their names in my personal log, noted the time of departure, and went about my afternoon duties. The first real sign that something was wrong did not come until that evening, well after sunset, when I was sitting on the kiosk porch and heard a sound from the direction of the hollow that I had never heard before in 13 years of service. It was not an animal call. It was not wind. It was not a tree falling or rocks shifting. It was a low, sustained tone, almost like a hum, but with a texture to it that felt organic. Alive. It rose in pitch slowly, held for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no frogs, no rustling in the underbrush. The forest had gone completely, perfectly still, as if every living thing within earshot had decided at the same instant to stop moving and stop breathing and wait. I stood on the porch for a long time, staring into the black wall of the tree line, and I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that 13 years in these mountains meant I had simply encountered a sound I had not cataloged yet. The Appalachians are old, the oldest mountains in North America. They have had 400 million years to develop their own vocabulary, and no human being, no matter how experienced, has heard all of it. I went inside, I locked the door. I checked the radio one more time, and when it gave me nothing but silence, I set it on the desk and went to bed. In the morning, I would learn that the group had made camp at the 5-mile marker, in a clearing beside a creek that does not appear on any official map. I would learn that Cheryl had woken in the night screaming. I would learn that when the others asked her what was wrong, she said she had seen two red lights floating in the tree line, low to the ground, roughly the height of a crouching man. She said they had been watching her. She said they had blinked. And I would learn that when Ryan shone his flashlight at the spot where she pointed, they found footprints in the mud beside the creek. Not animal prints, not boot prints, something in between. 5 toes, but too long, too narrow, and pressed so deep into the soft earth that whatever made them must have weighed 300 pounds or more. But that first night, I knew none of this. That first night I slept with the window open and the mountain air coming through the screen, and I dreamed of nothing at all. If you have been listening to this story, and you have not yet taken a moment to leave a like, I would ask you to do that now. These stories take a long time to tell, and even longer to live through, and your support means more than you might realize. Stay with me. This is only the beginning. I reached their camp at 10:15 the following morning. The hike in took me just under 2 hours, which was faster than usual because I was moving with purpose. The radio had remained silent through the night and into the dawn, and when I tried the satellite phone at 6:30, it had returned nothing but a low warbling tone I had never heard from the device before. 2 communication failures in 24 hours was unusual. 3 would have triggered protocol, but I was not yet at 3, and I told myself the rational explanation was a downed relay tower somewhere on the ridge. The trail to the 5-mile clearing follows the creek for the first 2 miles, then climbs sharply through a hemlock stand before leveling out on a narrow bench of land that runs along the western wall of the hollow. The hemlocks in this section are ancient, some of them 400 years old, and their branches interlock overhead so completely that walking beneath them feels like moving through a tunnel. No light reaches the floor. The air is cool and still and smells of wet bark and something faintly metallic that I have never been able to identify. I found the group in a state of controlled anxiety. Ryan was crouched beside the fire ring, feeding small sticks into the coals. Anna was sitting on a fallen log with her notebook open, writing rapidly. Nicholas was standing at the edge of the clearing with his arms crossed, facing the tree line. Cheryl was sitting in the doorway of her tent with a blanket around her shoulders despite the warmth of the morning. Jacob was brewing coffee on a camp stove, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided not to be afraid. Joyce was nowhere in sight. I asked where Joyce was. Anna looked up from her notebook and pointed toward the creek. She said Joyce had gone to wash up and had been gone about 20 minutes. I did not like that. 20 minutes was a long time to be alone beside a creek in this section of the forest, especially after what Cheryl had reported seeing in the night. I told Anna I would go find her and asked her to keep the rest of the group together until I returned. The creek was about 100 yards downslope from the clearing, running fast and shallow over a bed of gray stones. I found Joyce kneeling beside it, not washing, not filling a water bottle, just kneeling there with her hands on her thighs, staring at the opposite bank. I said her name and she did not react. I said it again, louder, and she turned her head slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. She said, "I was here 40 years ago. Did I tell you that?" I said she had not. She said, 40 years ago this August. I was 20. We came in a group of 4, my husband, his brother, a woman named Pauline, and me. We camped right here, right at this spot. We came because Roy, that was my husband's brother, he had heard the stories. He wanted to see for himself. I asked what stories she meant. She looked at me with an expression that was not afraid, but was something adjacent to afraid, something resigned. She said, "The thing with the red eyes. People have been seeing it in this hollow since before the logging camps. The Cherokee knew about it. They did not come here. They warned the settlers and the settlers did not listen. And then the settlers started seeing it too. Red eyes in the timber, red eyes at the edge of the firelight. Always watching, never blinking the way an animal blinks. Slow, deliberate, like it was thinking about you." I asked what had happened 40 years ago when she came with her husband and the others. Joyce stood up slowly, her knees cracking. She wiped her hands on her pants and looked at the trees across the creek. She said, "Pauline went to sleep the second night and did not wake up the same. She was not Pauline anymore. She looked like Pauline. She sounded like Pauline. But something in her eyes was different. Something was behind them that had not been there before." We took her out of the hollow and drove her home, and she never spoke about it. She moved away the following year. Roy tried to find her a decade later, and no one knew where she had gone. No records, no forwarding address. She was just gone. Joyce looked at me. She said, "I came back because I wanted to know if it was still here. I needed to know if it was still here." I told her we should return to the group. She nodded and followed me back up the slope without another word. When we reached the clearing, the atmosphere had changed. Nicholas was arguing with Ryan about whether to break camp and hike out. Cheryl was no longer sitting in her tent doorway. She was standing in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle, scanning the tree line with an intensity that bordered on frantic. Anna had closed her notebook and was watching Cheryl with concern. Jacob was the only one who seemed unchanged. He was still tending the coffee, still moving with that careful steadiness. Nicholas saw me and addressed me directly. He said, "She saw something last night. I believe her. I think we should pack up and get out of here before tonight." Ryan shook his head. He said it was probably a coyote or a raccoon. Eye shine from the fire could make any animal's eyes look strange. He said they had driven 7 hours to get here, and he was not leaving after one night because someone had a bad dream. Cheryl turned to Ryan and said, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain it was not a dream. I was awake. I was lying in my tent with my eyes open, looking at the mesh window, and I saw 2 red lights in the trees. They were not reflections. They were not fire. They were eyes. And they were looking at me specifically. Not at the camp, not at the tents. At me. And when I screamed, they did not run away. They just moved, slowly, to the left, behind a tree, and then they were gone. No one spoke for several seconds. Jacob poured coffee into a tin cup, took a sip, and said, "She is telling the truth." I heard something moving around the camp about 3 in the morning. Heavy steps. Not a deer, not a bear. Something that walked on 2 legs but did not walk the way a person walks. The rhythm was wrong, too slow, too deliberate. I made a decision in that moment that I have questioned every day since. I told them I would stay with them for the day and patrol the perimeter of the camp. I told them that if anything else happened during the coming night, I would personally escort them out at first light. I told them that in my professional experience, most unexplained sightings in the forest had rational explanations that only became apparent with time and observation. I believed what I was saying when I said it. I had not yet seen what I would see that night. The day passed slowly. I walked the perimeter in widening circles, looking for tracks, scat, disturbed vegetation, anything that might explain what Cheryl had seen and what Jacob had heard. I found the footprints they had described beside the creek. They were exactly as reported. 5 toes, elongated, deeply pressed into the mud. I measured one with my hand, and it was roughly 14 inches from heel to the tip of the longest toe. The stride between prints was nearly 4 feet. Whatever had made them was tall, heavy, and bipedal. I photographed the prints and continued my search. About 200 yards north of the camp, where the creek bends around a large boulder and the undergrowth thickens into a wall of rhododendron, I found something else. 3 trees standing in a rough triangle, each one scored with deep vertical gouges. The gouges were fresh. The exposed wood beneath the bark was still white and wet with sap. Each mark was roughly 5 inches long and spaced about 2 inches apart, consistent with 4 fingers dragged downward with tremendous force. The marks were approximately 7 feet off the ground. I stood there for a long time, looking at those gouges, feeling the forest settle around me like a held breath. The canopy above was so thick that I could barely see the sky. The air was completely still. No breeze, no bird calls, no insects. Just the sound of the creek and, beneath it, Something I was not entirely sure I was actually hearing or simply imagining. That low hum again. The same one from the previous night, sustained, organic, resonant. I returned to camp and told the group nothing about the gouges or the hum. I told them the footprints were likely from a large bear walking on its hind legs, which is not common but not unheard of. Nicholas looked at me in a way that made it clear he did not believe me. Cheryl closed her eyes and took a breath. Anna wrote something in her notebook. Ryan nodded as if the explanation satisfied him. Jacob watched me with those steady pale eyes and said nothing. Joyce sat with her back against a tree and stared at the ground. We ate dinner as the light faded. The hollow fills with shadow earlier than the surrounding ridges because of the depth of the ravine and the density of the canopy. By 7:30 the camp was in near total gloom, and by 8 the only light was the fire and a thin strip of gray sky visible through a gap in the branches directly overhead. The temperature dropped fast. Appalachian hollows can be 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding terrain, and Briarhook was deeper than most. At 9:30, Nicholas suggested they all sleep in shifts, with 2 people awake at all times. Ryan agreed. Anna volunteered for the first shift along with Nicholas. The others retreated to their tents. I positioned myself near the fire ring, facing the section of tree line where Cheryl had reported seeing the eyes. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Nicholas and I sat across the fire from each other, speaking occasionally in low voices. Anna had taken a position at the edge of the clearing with a flashlight and her notebook. The forest was quiet, but not silent. I could hear the creak, the occasional pop of the fire, the rustling of small animals in the leaf litter. Normal sounds, expected sounds. At 11:47, Anna turned off her flashlight without warning. Nicholas and I both looked at her. She was standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, facing the trees, and she was pointing. I followed her hand, and I saw them. 2 points of red light suspended in the shadows between the trees, roughly 6 feet off the ground. They were not bright. They did not cast any illumination on the surrounding foliage. They simply existed. 2 small circles of deep, steady crimson, the color of venous blood, hovering in the black space between the trunks of 2 hemlock trees. They were not reflections. The fire was behind me and to my left, and the angle was wrong for any kind of eyeshine. And they were not flashlights or LEDs or any manufactured light source I could identify. They had an organic quality to them, a warmth that was not thermal, but somehow alive. Nicholas stood up slowly. He said one word. There. The red lights moved. They shifted to the right, smoothly, without bobbing the way a walking creature's eyes would bob. They glided. Then they stopped. And I swear to you, I swear on everything I have left in this world, they blinked. Both of them. Simultaneously. A slow, deliberate closure and reopening. Like a predator that wants its prey to know it can see them. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the spot. The beam cut through the shadows and illuminated tree trunks, underbrush, ferns. Nothing else. The red lights were gone. Not faded, not retreated. Gone, as if they had never existed. Anna was breathing hard. Nicholas had not moved. I swept the flashlight in an arc, covering the entire tree line. Nothing. Then Jacob's voice came from behind us, from the direction of his tent. It was calm and measured and terrified. He said, "Do not look behind you. Whatever you do, do not turn around. It is standing right behind the tents." I turned around. I could not help it. Every instinct in my body overrode Jacob's warning, and I turned, and I saw it. Not clearly, not entirely, but enough. A shape standing upright at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the line of tents. It was tall. Impossibly tall. 8 feet at least, maybe more, with proportions that were almost human but stretched and wrong, as if someone had taken a person and pulled them upward like clay. Its shoulders were too narrow for its height. Its arms hung past its knees. Its head was slightly too large and tilted at an angle that no human neck should allow. And its eyes were open, red, burning, fixed on me with an intelligence that was not animal and was not human. Something older, something that had been watching from this hollow long before any of us were born. I do not know how long we stared at each other. It might have been 5 seconds. It might have been a minute. The fire cracked behind me and the spell broke and the thing stepped backward, a single step that carried it an impossible distance, and it was gone. Not into the trees, not behind the tents. Gone. As if the shadows had opened and swallowed it and closed again. No one slept after that. We sat around the fire with every flashlight and headlamp we had, and we waited for morning. It did not come back, but we could hear it, moving through the forest around us in slow, patient circles, branch by branch, step by step, circling us like something that had all the time in the world and knew it. Jacob said, almost to himself, "It has been here for centuries." The Cherokee called this place a wound in the mountain. They said something crawled into the wound and never left. Something with red eyes and long patience. They said it does not kill. It does something worse. No one asked him what he meant. I think we were all too afraid of the answer. We broke camp before first light. I use that phrase loosely because true first light does not reach the bottom of Briarhook Hollow until nearly 7:30 in the morning, and we were packed and moving by 5:15. The air was cold and wet, and the only illumination came from our headlamps, 6 beams cutting through the mist that had settled in the ravine overnight. The fire had burned down to a gray circle of ash. The forest was silent. I took point and set a pace that was faster than comfortable for Joyce and Jacob, but slower than urgency demanded. Ryan walked directly behind me. Anna was behind Ryan, then Cheryl and Nicholas together, then Jacob and Joyce at the rear. I did not like having the older members of the group at the back, but Jacob had insisted, and there was something in his voice that suggested arguing would waste time we did not have. The trail from the 5-mile clearing back to the trailhead follows the creek for about a mile before climbing up to the hemlock bench. In the pre-dawn gloom, with mist rising off the water and the trees pressing in from both sides, the creek trail felt less like a path and more like a throat. The walls of vegetation on either side were dense and lightless. The sound of the water covered any other noise that might have been coming from the forest around us. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when Cheryl stopped. Nicholas, who was beside her, stopped too. I turned around. In the beam of my headlamp, Cheryl's face was white and rigid. She said, "I can hear it." Off to the left, paralleling us. I listened. Over the sound of the creek I could hear nothing, but Cheryl was not the kind of person to fabricate danger. She had been the first to sense something wrong at the trailhead, the first to see the eyes, and every instinct she had demonstrated over the past 2 days had proven accurate. I told the group to keep moving, close together, no gaps. I fell back from point position and let Ryan lead, walking instead alongside Cheryl and Nicholas. Anna moved up to walk behind Ryan. Jacob and Joyce maintained their pace at the rear. For the next 15 minutes, we moved in silence. The trail climbed gradually, the creek falling away below us to the right. The mist thinned as we gained elevation, but the canopy remained impenetrable overhead, a solid ceiling of interlocked branches that turned the forest into a roofed space, like the nave of a cathedral built for something that was not human. At the point where the trail reaches the hemlock bench and levels out, I noticed that Joyce had stopped walking. She was standing on the trail about 30 feet behind the rest of us, motionless, her headlamp pointed at the ground. Jacob was beside her, one hand on her shoulder, speaking to her in a voice too low for me to hear. I called back to them. Joyce did not respond. Jacob looked up at me, and the expression on his face sent a current of cold through my chest. He said, "She cannot move her legs. She says something is holding her." I walked back to them quickly, scanning the trail and the undergrowth with my flashlight. Joyce was standing upright, her pack still on her shoulders, her arms at her sides. Her legs were slightly apart, planted firmly on the trail as if she had been nailed there. Her eyes were open and aware, but there was something in them that I had never seen before. Not fear, not confusion, vacancy, as if Joyce was still present in her body, but something else was also present, occupying the same space, pressing in from the outside. I knelt beside her and checked her legs. There was nothing holding them, no vines, no mud, no physical obstruction of any kind. But when I tried to lift her foot, I could not move it. It was as if her boots had been bonded to the earth itself, fused to the rock and soil beneath them with a force that exceeded anything I could exert with my hands. Nicholas came back and tried as well. Then Ryan. The three of us could not move Joyce's feet even a fraction of an inch. Joyce spoke then, and her voice was different, lower, rougher, as if she were speaking through a throat that had been compressed. She said, "It remembers me. From before. It let me leave the first time because it wanted me to come back. It has been waiting for 40 years. It does not experience time the way we do. 40 years is nothing to it. 40 years is a breath." Jacob's hand tightened on her shoulder. He said, "Joyce, come back. Stay here. Look at me." Joyce's eyes moved to Jacob, and for a moment she was herself again. Fully, completely Joyce. The vacancy receded, and in its place was a terror so profound that it was almost unbearable to witness. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not a word, but a sound, a low keening that rose and broke and became a sob. She said, "It is underneath us. Right now, under the ground. It lives in the mountain. The hollow is where it breathes." Then her feet released. Whatever had been holding her let go without warning, and she stumbled forward into Jacob's arms. He caught her and steadied her, and we moved, all of us together, faster now, no longer walking but close to running, the trail unspooling beneath our headlamps as the hemlock bench narrowed and the ravine walls rose on either side. We were 2 miles from the trailhead when the sound began again. That hum. That low, resonant, living hum. But this time it was not coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. From the trees. From the ground beneath our feet. From the stone walls of the ravine that were now close enough on both sides that I could have touched them with outstretched arms. The hum filled the hollow like water filling a vessel, rising steadily, pressing against the inside of my skull with a pressure that was not painful, but was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Anna dropped her notebook. She did not pick it up. She pressed her hands over her ears and kept walking. Cheryl was crying silently, tears running down her face, but her steps never faltered. Ryan was breathing hard through his nose, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Nicholas had positioned himself behind Joyce and Jacob and was walking backward, facing the trail behind us, sweeping his flashlight in wide arcs. The trail entered the section I had always dreaded. The jaw. The narrow ravine with 60-foot walls on either side. The passage is roughly 40 feet wide at the opening, but narrows to less than 10 at its tightest point. The stone walls are sheer and wet and covered in moss, and at the bottom of the ravine the trail is compressed to a thin ribbon of packed earth between the creek and the cliff face. There is nowhere to go. No side trails, no escape routes, just forward or backward. We entered the jaw. The hum grew louder. I was 15 feet inside the passage when I saw the eyes again. Not behind us this time. Ahead of us. 2 red points of light positioned directly in the center of the trail, blocking our path. They were low to the ground now, maybe 3 feet up, as if the thing had crouched down to meet us at eye level. And in the faint wash of my headlamp, I could see the shape behind the eyes. Not clearly. Not well enough to draw or describe with any precision. But I could see that it was large and that it was not standing in the passage. It was filling it. Its body pressed against both walls of the ravine, its limbs braced against the stone, its head lowered so that those red eyes looked up at us from below, inverted, wrong, like a spider waiting at the center of a web. We stopped. All of us. There was nowhere to go. The passage behind us was open, but none of us wanted to turn our backs to those eyes. Joyce stepped forward. Jacob grabbed her arm and she pulled free. She stepped forward again, past me, past Ryan, and she stood in the passage with her headlamp illuminating the stone walls and the thing crouched between them. She spoke to it, not in English, not in any language I recognized. Short, sharp syllables that echoed off the ravine walls and seemed to agitate the air itself. The hum changed pitch. Lower, angrier. The red eyes narrowed. Joyce spoke again, louder this time. Her voice cracked but did not break. She raised one hand, palm out, and held it toward the thing in the passage. The red eyes fixed on her hand. The hum dropped to a frequency I could feel in my teeth. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The silence was absolute. The creek had stopped running. The mist had stopped moving. Even the air in my lungs seemed to have stopped cycling. Then Joyce lowered her hand and the thing moved. It moved upward. It unfolded itself from the passage floor and climbed the ravine wall with a speed and fluidity that should have been impossible for something that size. It went straight up, its limbs finding purchase on the wet stone without slipping, its body compressing and extending in ways that no skeleton I know of could accommodate. Within seconds it had reached the top of the 60-foot wall, and it paused there, silhouetted against the strip of gray sky above us, and for one terrible moment I saw its outline clearly. The elongated torso, the arms that reached nearly to the ground from that height, the head, too large, tilted at that impossible angle, and the eyes, still burning, still red, still watching. Then it was gone, over the edge, into the forest above, and the hum stopped, and the creek resumed its flow, and the mist began to move again, and the world reassembled itself around us as if nothing had happened. We walked through the jaw in silence. We walked the remaining 1.5 miles to the trailhead in silence. We emerged from the tree line at 8:43 in the morning, into sunlight so bright and warm that it felt like a physical assault after the perpetual gloom of the hollow. I tried the radio. It worked. I called dispatch and reported the group's safe return. I did not mention the eyes. I did not mention the hum or the gouges on the trees or the footprints in the mud. I did not mention Joyce speaking in a language I could not identify, or the thing that had blocked the jaw and then climbed a 60-foot vertical wall as if gravity were a suggestion rather than a law. The group loaded their vehicles in silence. Ryan Ford shook my hand before he left, and I could feel his fingers trembling. Anna Sullivan had left her notebook somewhere on the trail and did not go back for it. Nicholas Wallace sat in the driver's seat of the Explorer for a long time before starting the engine, staring at the tree line, his jaw working as if he were chewing words he could not bring himself to speak. Cheryl Hamilton got into the passenger seat and closed her eyes and did not open them until the vehicle began to move. Jacob Graham stopped beside me before getting into the Explorer. He looked old in the sunlight, older than his 68 years. He looked like a man who had seen something that had rearranged the furniture of his understanding, and he was still stumbling through the new arrangement, bumping into corners he did not know were there. He said, "It let us go. You understand that? It let us go." I said I understood. He said, "It let Joyce go 40 years ago, and it let her come back. It let all of us walk in, and it let all of us walk out. Why would something that powerful, something that old, let us go?" I did not have an answer. Jacob said, "Because it was not hungry. Not yet. It was curious. It was studying us, learning us. And when it has learned enough, it will come down from the hollow. Not for us. For everyone." He got into the vehicle, and they drove away, and I stood in the gravel lot and watched the dust settle. And then I turned and looked at the trailhead sign, and I looked at the trail disappearing into the trees, and I felt the mountains watching me the way they have always watched, with that patient, ancient, inhuman attention. I closed the trail the next day. I filed the paperwork and cited structural concerns about the jaw passage, which was technically true. The ravine walls are eroding. The trail is narrowing. Those are facts. But the real reason I closed it is something I will carry for the rest of my career, and probably the rest of my life. I closed it because I looked into those red eyes and I saw something I cannot explain and do not want to understand. I saw intelligence. I saw patience. I saw hunger that had not yet arrived but was coming, the way winter comes, slowly and then all at once. Joyce Woods called me 3 weeks after the hike. She said she had been having dreams about the hollow, not nightmares, just dreams. In the dreams, she was walking the trail alone, at night, without a headlamp, and she could see perfectly. She said the trees looked different in the dreams. taller, older, the kind of trees that do not exist anymore in the waking world. And at the end of the trail, at the bottom of the jaw, the red eyes were waiting for her, and in the dreams she was not afraid. In the dreams she sat down beside the thing and it sat beside her, and they watched the creek together in silence, like two old friends who have run out of things to say. She said, "I think it showed me what it really is. Not a monster, not a predator, something older than those categories, something that was here before the mountain and will be here after the mountain is gone. And it is lonely. It has been lonely for a very long time." I did not know what to say to that. I still do not. The trail remains closed. I check the trailhead every few weeks, making sure the barriers are in place, making sure no one has gone in. Each time I stand at the edge of the tree line and listen, and sometimes, on still evenings when the wind is down and the hollow is quiet, I can hear it, the hum, low and sustained and patient, waiting. I have told you this story because I believe you deserve to know that there are places in these mountains that do not belong to us. They never have. We walk through them and we camp beside their creeks and we build our fires in their clearings, and we tell ourselves that the wilderness is ours to explore and understand. But the wilderness does not agree. The wilderness has its own tenants, its own residents, its own intelligence, and some of them have red eyes that never stop watching. If you have made it this far, I want you to know that everything I have described is what I witnessed. I have not embellished. I have not invented. I have told it as it happened, in the order it happened, and I have left out only the details that do not matter. The details that matter, the eyes, the hum, the footprints, Joyce's frozen legs, the thing in the jaw, those I have given you exactly as I experienced them. I do not go into the hollow anymore, but the hollow, I suspect, has not forgotten me. Some nights when I am lying in my bunk at the station, I can feel it out there, not close, not near, but present, aware, watching. The red eyes of Briarhook Hollow are still burning, and sooner or later I believe they will come down from the mountain.